The stagecoach door swung open, and Clara Whitmore stepped into the Texas dust with trembling hands clutching a worn letter, a promise of marriage, a future, a new beginning. But the man waiting wasn't her groom. "He's already married," the stranger said, his voice flat as the prairie horizon. "Found himself a widow with land. You're not needed anymore." In that moment, standing in a town of silent, pitying stares, Clara realized she'd been replaced before she'd even arrived. Abandoned, unwanted, until a cowboy's voice cut through the crowd. "Then she's free to choose me. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this journey has traveled." The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of Henderson's General Store, sending up a cloud of pale dust that hung in the afternoon air like a veil between Clara Whitmore and her new life. For 3 weeks she had endured the bone-jarring journey from Boston, 3 weeks of sleepless nights on hard benches, stale bread that scratched her throat, and the constant company of strangers who asked too many questions. 3 weeks of hope carried in the careful folds of letters tucked inside her bodice, letters that promised her a future in a place she'd never seen with a man she'd never met. Clara smoothed her traveling dress, once a respectable gray silk, now creased and dulled by dust, and adjusted the small hat pinned to her dark hair. She was 24 years old, educated enough to know better, desperate enough to try anyway. Boston had offered her nothing after her father's death left her penniless, and her distant relatives made it clear she was a burden they wouldn't carry. The advertisement in the Boston Evening Transcript had seemed like Providence. Respectable gentleman rancher in Texas Hill Country seeks correspondence with well-bred woman of good character for matrimony. Must be willing to embrace frontier life. Serious inquiries only. Robert Mitchell's letters had been cordial, if not warm. He described his property, 500 acres of grazing land, a sturdy house, a small but growing herd. He wrote of his intentions to build something lasting, something that required a proper wife to make it complete. He never mentioned love, but Clara hadn't expected love. She expected security, purpose, a place where she belonged. That had seemed like enough. The driver hauled her trunk down from the coach roof with a heavy thud that made her wince. Everything she owned in the world was in that battered case. She pressed a gloved hand to her stomach, trying to calm the flutter of nerves that had been building since they crossed into Texas 2 days ago. "This is it, miss," the driver said, wiping sweat from his leathery face. "Henderson, Texas. Someone meeting you?" "Yes," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mr. Robert Mitchell. He should be—" "You Miss Whitmore?" The voice came from behind her, sharp and businesslike. Clara turned to find a thin man in a brown suit approaching, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't smiling. Something in his expression made her hands go cold despite the heat. "I am," she said, lifting her chin. "And you are?" "Daniel Fairchild. I work for Mr. Mitchell." He glanced at her trunk, then back at her face, his eyes sliding away almost immediately. "We need to talk. Not here." "Come with me." Clara's stomach tightened. "Where's Mr. Mitchell? He wrote that he would meet me personally." "He's occupied." Fairchild gestured toward a small office across the street. "Please, Miss Whitmore. This won't take long." The stagecoach driver was already climbing back onto his bench, anxious to make the next town before nightfall. Other passengers were dispersing into the dusty street. Clara felt suddenly, acutely alone. She glanced around the town, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, their paint faded by the relentless sun. A few people stood on the boardwalk, watching. A woman in a faded calico dress, 2 men outside the saloon, a shopkeeper sweeping his threshold, all of them looking at her with the peculiar intensity of small-town strangers observing something unusual. "Very well," Clara said quietly. She followed Fairchild across the street, her boots clicking on the sun-baked planks of the boardwalk. The office was cramped and stuffy, smelling of old paper and tobacco. Fairchild gestured to a wooden chair, but Clara remained standing. Some instinct told her she would need every inch of dignity she could muster for what was coming. Fairchild removed his hat, revealing thinning hair plastered to his scalp with sweat. He cleared his throat. "Miss Whitmore, there's been a change in circumstances." "What sort of change?" "Mr. Mitchell has married." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. For a moment, Clara couldn't process them. Married. The word didn't make sense. She had his last letter in her reticule, dated only 6 weeks ago, confirming her arrival date and expressing his anticipation of their union. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "Mr. Mitchell and I have an agreement. I have his letters. He sent money for my passage. I'm aware of the correspondence." Fairchild's voice was flat, reciting facts he'd clearly rehearsed. However, 3 weeks ago, Mr. Mitchell became reacquainted with Mrs. Evelyn Cartwright, a widow who owns the adjoining property. They were married last Saturday. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. 3 weeks ago, when I was already on the stagecoach. The opportunity arose suddenly. Mrs. Cartwright is an established landowner with significant resources. From a practical standpoint, I was already on my way. Clara's voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. I sold everything I owned. I left Boston with nothing but the promise he made. Does that mean nothing? Fairchild had the grace to look uncomfortable. Mr. Mitchell regrets any inconvenience. He's prepared to compensate you for your travel expenses and provide funds for your return to Boston. Return to what? The words burst out before Clara could stop them. There's nothing in Boston for me. That's why I left. That's why I answered his advertisement in the first place. I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore, truly. For the first time, Fairchild's professional mask slipped, revealing something that might have been genuine sympathy. But the decision is made. You can collect the compensation from the bank tomorrow morning. I can recommend a boarding house for tonight. Mrs. Brennan keeps a clean establishment on 4th Street. Clara stood frozen, her mind racing through impossible calculations. The money he was offering wouldn't be enough to establish herself anywhere, wouldn't be enough to start over again. It would barely cover a few months' room and board, if that. And then what? Return to Boston to beg for charity from relatives who had already made their contempt clear? Find work as a seamstress or a governess, always one disaster away from complete destitution? I need to speak with Mr. Mitchell directly, she said, grasping for any foothold in this collapsing situation. Surely he owes me that much. Fairchild shook his head. He's away on his wedding trip. Won't return for 2 weeks. Of course he was. Of course he'd made sure to absent himself, to avoid any confrontation or accountability. Clara felt something hardening in her chest, something cold and sharp. I see, she said quietly. Then I suppose there's nothing more to discuss. She turned and walked out of the office before Fairchild could respond, before the trembling in her hands could spread to her voice. The afternoon sun hit her like a physical blow, bright and merciless. She stood on the boardwalk, momentarily blind, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed in public. The street had filled with more people now. The afternoon stage always drew a crowd in small towns hungry for news and novelty. Clara could feel their stares, could practically hear the whispers starting. The mail-order bride. The one who got replaced. Poor thing. What will she do now? Her trunk still sat in the dust where the driver had left it. Everything she owned, abandoned in the street like trash. The metaphor was so perfect, it would have been funny if it weren't destroying her. Miss, you all right? Clara turned to find an older woman approaching, concern creasing her weathered face. She wore a simple dress and apron, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. I'm fine, Clara said automatically, the lie feeling like ash in her mouth. Just getting my bearings. You're the one came for Bobby Mitchell, aren't you? The woman's eyes were kind but knowing. I'm Helen Brennan. Run the boarding house. That weasel Fairchild send you to me? He mentioned your establishment. I bet he did. Helen's mouth tightened. Been expecting you since word got around about Bobby's sudden wedding. What a mess. What a shameful, cowardly mess. The sympathy in her voice almost broke Clara's composure. She gripped her reticule tighter, nails biting into the fabric through her gloves. I need to arrange accommodation for the night, possibly longer while I make arrangements. Of course, dear, my rates are fair, and she won't need your boarding house, Helen. The new voice was deeper, edged with something hard and certain. Clara turned toward it and found herself looking up at a man who seemed to have materialized from the very dust of Texas itself. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders stretching a work-worn cotton shirt. His face was sun-darkened, marked with the fine lines of someone who spent his days squinting into bright horizons. Dark hair curled slightly beneath a battered hat, and his eyes, gray as storm clouds, fixed on Clara with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Ethan Cole," Helen said, a note of warning in her voice. "This isn't your concern." "The hell it isn't." Ethan's gaze didn't leave Clara's face. "A man makes promises. He keeps them. That's how it works, or how it should work." Fairchild had emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion. "Mr. Cole, this is a private matter." "Private?" Ethan turned on him, and there was such controlled fury in the movement that Fairchild actually stepped back. "You parade this woman's humiliation in the middle of Main Street and call it private? Mitchell sends for her, lets her travel halfway across the country, then marries someone else while she's still on the road. Where I come from, we call that dishonorable." A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the confrontation. Clara wanted to disappear, to sink into the dust and be carried away by the wind. But she stood frozen, watching this stranger defend her honor when her supposed fiancé had discarded her like unwanted cargo. "Mr. Mitchell made a business decision," Fairchild said stiffly. "Mrs. Cartwright brought substantial assets to the marriage." "So it's about money." Ethan's voice was flat with disgust. "That makes it better? You think that justifies breaking his word?" "Mr. Cole, really, this is—" Fairchild glanced nervously at the growing crowd. "This is hardly the place." "No, this is exactly the place." Ethan gestured to the people watching. "Let everyone hear it. Bobby Mitchell is a coward who hides behind lawyers and leaves women stranded because he found a better deal. Let that be known." Clara found her voice, though it came out smaller than she wanted. "Please, this isn't necessary. I don't need—" "You need someone to speak truth." Ethan's eyes met hers again, and she saw something unexpected there. Not pity, but recognition. As if he understood exactly what it felt like to be cast aside, to be deemed not good enough. "You traveled 3 weeks on faith in a man's word. That word should mean something." "The situation is regrettable," Fairchild said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "But it's resolved. Miss Whitmore will be compensated, and—" "Compensated." Ethan spat the word like a curse. "You put a price on a woman's future and call it compensation. What would you have me do?" Fairchild's professional composure was cracking. "Mr. Mitchell is married. The arrangement with Miss Whitmore is void. These are the facts." "Facts." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. Then he turned to Clara, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, still firm, but gentler. "Ma'am, you traveled here on a promise of marriage, a home, a future. Is that right?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "And you left everything behind in Boston because you believed that promise?" "Yes," she whispered. Ethan turned back to the crowd, his voice rising so everyone could hear. "Then Bobby Mitchell," broke his word. "Which means Miss Whitmore is free. Free of any obligation to a man who proved himself unworthy. Free to make her own choice about what happens next." He paused, and the silence that followed was so complete Clara could hear the creak of the general store's sign swaying in the breeze. "Which means," Ethan continued, his eyes finding Clara's once more, "she's free to choose me, if she wants." The crowd erupted in whispers. Helen Brennan gasped. Fairchild's mouth fell open, and Clara stood frozen, the world narrowing to the steady gray gaze of this stranger who had just upended everything in the span of 10 minutes. "Mr. Cole," she managed, "you don't even know me." "No, ma'am, I don't." His voice was steady, honest. "But I know what it's like to be dealt a bad hand through no fault of your own. And I know that a woman who's brave enough to cross the country on faith alone is a woman worth knowing." "This is absurd," Fairchild sputtered. "Miss Whitmore, you cannot seriously consider—" "Why not?" Ethan cut him off. "She came here for a marriage proposal. I'm making one. Only difference is I'm not going to change my mind halfway through because someone with more money comes along." Clara's head was spinning. This couldn't be happening. Men didn't just propose to complete strangers in the middle of the street. But then again, she'd been prepared to marry Robert Mitchell, and he'd been a stranger too. At least Ethan Cole had the honesty to look her in the eye when he spoke. "I have a ranch," Ethan continued, speaking directly to Clara now, ignoring everyone else. 300 acres, good water, decent grazing. House needs work, but it's sound. I'm not rich, but I'm not poor either. I can provide for a wife, treat her with respect, keep my word. He paused. That's what I'm offering. Not romance, not fancy promises, just honesty and a fair partnership. You can't expect her to answer now, Helen interjected, her voice concerned. The girl just arrived, just had her world turned upside down. I don't expect anything, Ethan said quietly. I'm just making sure she knows she has a choice, that's all. A choice. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so courtly it seemed incongruous with his work-roughened hands. Ma'am, you think on it. Take your time. Helen will put you up at the boarding house. I'll cover the cost. No obligations. You decide what you want to do, and whatever you decide, I'll respect it. He turned to go, and Clara heard herself speak before she'd consciously decided to. Mr. Cole. He stopped, glancing back. Why? The question came out raw, genuine. Why would you do this? You don't know anything about me. I could be anything, anyone. For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Could say the same about you, ma'am. You were willing to marry Bobby Mitchell sight unseen. At least you've seen me before I made my offer. That was different. We corresponded for months. Letters can lie. His voice was quiet but certain. I'd rather judge a person by what they do when things go wrong than by what they promise when things are easy. You just had your future pulled out from under you, and you're still standing here with your head up. That tells me what I need to know. He tipped his hat once more and walked away, his boots echoing on the boardwalk. The crowd parted for him, and Clara watched him go, this stranger who had just offered her. What exactly? Rescue? Or just a different kind of arrangement with a different stranger? Helen touched her arm gently. Come on, dear, let's get you settled. You've had enough spectacle for one day. Clara let herself be led away, only half aware of the whispers that followed. Her mind was reeling, trying to process everything that had happened in the last hour. She'd arrived expecting one future and found it destroyed. And in its place, impossibly, was something she didn't have words for yet. The boarding house was clean and plain, exactly as Fairchild had described. Helen showed her to a small room on the second floor, whitewashed walls and simple furniture, a window overlooking the street. I'll bring up some water for washing, Helen said, and supper's at 6. Nothing fancy, but it's hot and there's plenty of it. Thank you. Clara's voice sounded distant to her own ears. Mrs. Brennan, do you know Mr. Cole? Is he a good man? Helen paused in the doorway, considering. Ethan Cole is one of the most honest men I've ever met. Came here 5 years ago with nothing. Built that ranch through sheer stubbornness and hard work. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair in his dealings. Never known him to break his word. Has he ever done anything like this before? Proposed to a stranger in the middle of Main Street? Helen's eyes crinkled with something between amusement and concern. Can't say he has, but then I've never seen him stand by and watch an injustice without speaking up either. That's just his way. After Helen left, Clara sank onto the narrow bed and finally let herself shake. The tears she'd been holding back came in silent waves, not dramatic sobs, but the quiet, desperate crying of someone who'd been holding themselves together for too long. She wept for the future she'd lost, for the humiliation of being replaced, for the bone-deep exhaustion of 3 weeks' travel that had led to nothing. But somewhere beneath the grief and shock, there was something else, a tiny, stubborn spark that Ethan Cole's words had kindled. She's free to choose me. Clara had spent her entire life having choices made for her. Her father chose her education, her social circle, her prospects. After his death, her relatives chose to cast her aside. Robert Mitchell had seemed like a choice she was making for herself. But even that had been an illusion. She'd simply been accepting the one option available to her. But this strange, impossible offer from a man with storm-gray eyes and calloused hands, this was different. Because he'd said she was free to choose or refuse, free to decide. Clara stood and went to the window. The sun was lowering toward the horizon, painting the dusty street in shades of amber and rose. She could see her trunk still sitting outside the general store, waiting to be collected. Everything she owned suspended between one life and another. Tomorrow, she would have to decide. Return to Boston and certain poverty. Try to make a life in this town alone with insufficient funds and no prospects, or accept Ethan Cole's extraordinary offer. But tonight, for just a few hours, she let herself exist in the space between. The space where she was no one's burden, no one's disappointment, no one's rejected bride. Just Clara Whitmore, standing at a crossroads, still holding her head up. Below her window, a figure moved through the deepening shadows. Ethan Cole, leading a horse toward the livery stable. He didn't look up, didn't check to see if she was watching. He simply went about his business with the same steady purpose he'd shown in everything else. Clara pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the day's heat still radiating from it. She thought of his words. A woman who's brave enough to cross the country on faith alone is a woman worth knowing. No one had ever called her brave before. Foolish, perhaps. Desperate, certainly. But brave? As the last light faded from the sky, Clara made a decision. Not about marriage or Ethan Cole or her future, but a smaller decision, one that was entirely her own. Tomorrow, she would ask to see his ranch. Not to accept his proposal, not yet, but to understand what he was really offering. To see if a man who spoke so plainly about honesty and respect actually lived those values. She would choose, one way or another. But she would choose with her eyes open, with all the information she could gather. She would choose based on what she saw, not just what she was told. For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, Clara felt something that wasn't grief or panic or fear. She felt possibility. And in the gathering darkness of a Texas town that had witnessed her humiliation and her unexpected reprieve, that feeling was enough to let her finally breathe. Clara woke to unfamiliar sounds. A rooster crowing somewhere distant, the creak of wagon wheels on dirt, voices calling out morning greetings in accents still foreign to her Boston-trained ear. For a disorienting moment, she forgot where she was, reaching instinctively for the familiar weight of her mother's quilt before remembering it had been sold months ago to pay her father's debts. The events of yesterday crashed over her like cold water. The rejection. The humiliation. Ethan Cole's impossible offer. She sat up, her body aching from the stagecoach journey and the thin mattress. Morning light slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Her traveling dress hung on a peg, creased beyond redemption, and she grimaced at the thought of wearing it again. But it was this or the two other dresses in her trunk, and she needed to save those for what? She didn't even know anymore. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Whitmore, it's Helen. I've brought some breakfast." Clara wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and opened the door. Helen carried a tray with cornbread, eggs, and coffee that smelled like heaven. "You didn't have to bring it up?" Clara said, embarrassed. "I could have come down. Figured you might want some privacy this morning." Helen set the tray on the small table by the window. "Whole town's talking, as you might imagine. Thought you could use a bit of peace before facing the world." Clara's stomach twisted. "What are they saying?" Helen hesitated, then seemed to decide on honesty. "Mixed things. Some feel sorry for you. Some think Bobby Mitchell's a snake, which he is. Some are making bets on whether you'll take Ethan up on his offer." She paused. "And some, I'm sorry to say, are wondering what's wrong with you that made Mitchell choose someone else." The words stung, even though Clara had expected them. Small towns were the same everywhere, quick to judge, slow to forget. She sat down heavily, suddenly not hungry despite the appealing smell of the food. "Ignore the gossips," Helen said firmly. "They'll find something else to chew on soon enough. You just worry about what's right for you." She moved toward the door, then turned back. "Ethan Cole stopped by early this morning. Left word that if you wanted to see his ranch, he'd be at the livery stable at 10 o'clock. No pressure," he said. "Just if you were interested." Clara's pulse quickened. She glanced at the small clock on the mantel, 8:30, an hour and a half to decide if she was brave enough to take the next step. After Helen left, Clara forced herself to eat, knowing she needed the strength regardless of what she decided. The cornbread was sweet and crumbly, the eggs perfectly cooked. Simple food, but made with care. She found herself wondering if Ethan Cole cooked for himself, if his ranch house had a kitchen where someone had once made meals like this. if he sat alone at a table built for two. She washed and dressed in her best remaining dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes and hadn't suffered too badly in the trunk. She pinned her hair carefully, her hands steadier than they'd been yesterday. When she looked in the small mirror above the washstand, she saw a woman who looked tired and uncertain, but not defeated. Not yet. The walk to the livery stable took less than 5 minutes, but Clara felt every eye in town on her. Women paused in their sweeping to watch. Men tipped their hats with expressions ranging from sympathy to speculation. A group of children playing in the street stopped their game to stare until their mother shooed them away with a sharp word. Clara kept her chin up and her eyes forward, the way her mother had taught her. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't give this town the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. The livery stable was a large wooden structure at the edge of town, smelling of hay and horse and leather. Ethan Cole stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the neck of a beautiful chestnut mare. He'd cleaned up since yesterday, fresh shirt, hair still damp from washing, but there was no disguising the essential roughness of him, the way he seemed more comfortable in his own skin than any man Clara had ever met in Boston's drawing rooms. He saw her approaching and straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Whitmore, wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either," Clara admitted, "but I decided I should at least see what you're offering before I make any decisions." Something that might have been respect flickered in his gray eyes. "That's fair. That's smart." He gestured to the mare. "This is Copper, gentle as a lamb, and she knows the way home, even if I don't. You comfortable riding?" Clara thought of the sedate park ride she'd taken in Boston, ladies perched side saddle on docile rental horses. "I've ridden, though probably not like you mean it." "We'll take it easy." Ethan led out a second horse, a large bay gelding. "This is Duke. He'll carry both of us if you'd rather not ride alone, but I figured you might prefer your own mount." The consideration surprised her. Robert Mitchell's letters had been full of assumptions about what she would and wouldn't do, never once asking her preference. "I'll try Copper, if you think she'll tolerate me." "She will." Ethan held the mare steady while Clara approached. "Just talk to her soft, let her get your scent." Clara extended her hand, letting the horse sniff her palm. Copper's nose was velvet soft, her dark eyes intelligent and calm. Something in Clara's chest loosened slightly. "Hello, beautiful girl," she murmured. "She likes you already." Ethan brought over a side saddle, another small consideration that made Clara's throat tight. "Let me help you up." His hands were strong and sure as he lifted her into the saddle, careful not to touch her more than necessary. Clara arranged her skirts, acutely aware of how improper this all was, riding out alone with a man she'd met yesterday. But then, she'd been prepared to marry a man she'd never met at all, so perhaps propriety was a luxury she could no longer afford. They rode out of town heading west, the morning sun warm on Clara's back. The land opened up before them in a way that made her heart catch. Endless rolling hills covered in golden grass, stands of oak trees clustered in the low places, the sky so vast and blue it seemed to swallow the world. It was nothing like Boston with its brick buildings and crowded streets and harbor smell. This was raw and wild and terrifyingly beautiful. "It's 3 miles to my place," Ethan said, keeping Duke to a steady walk beside her. "Not far, but far enough from town that you get some peace, some quiet to think." "Do you prefer being alone?" Clara asked, then immediately worried she'd been too forward. But Ethan didn't seem offended. "I don't mind it. Grew up in a big family, 7 brothers, 2 sisters. Always noise, always someone needing something. When I came out here, the silence felt like a gift." He paused. "But I won't lie and say it doesn't get lonely sometimes. Man can only talk to his horses so long before he starts questioning his sanity." A surprised laugh escaped Clara's lips, and Ethan's expression lightened at the sound. "There it is," he said quietly. "Wondered if you could still laugh after yesterday." "I wondered that myself," Clara admitted. The movement of the horse beneath her, the clean air, the space to breathe, it was helping. Not healing, not yet, but helping. They rode in companionable silence for a while, and Clara found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. His hands on the reins were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who worked hard every day. His profile was strong, marked by sun and wind, not handsome in the classical sense, but compelling in a way she couldn't quite name. And the way he sat his horse, easy and natural, like they were part of the same creature, spoke of years in the saddle. "You said you came here 5 years ago," Clara ventured. "Where from?" "Oklahoma Territory. My father had a small farm there, but too many sons and not enough land to split between us all. I'm the youngest, so I knew I'd get nothing when he passed. Decided to make my own way." He gestured at the landscape around them. "Texas was offering land grants to settlers willing to work it. 300 acres if you could prove it up, build a dwelling, maintain livestock, stay for 5 years. I'm in my last year. Come next spring, it's mine free and clear." "That must feel good, building something that's truly yours." "It does." He glanced at her. "What about you? Your letters to Mitchell, he shared some of them around town before the wedding, showing off. You mentioned you taught at a girls' school?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the thought of her private words being circulated like gossip. "I did. Music and literature. After my father died, I tried to keep the position, but..." She hesitated, then decided she owed him honesty if he was offering it to her. "The school's patroness made it clear she didn't want someone with my circumstances teaching her daughter, tainted by financial scandal," she said, as if poverty were contagious. "That's cruel. That's Boston." Clara heard the bitterness in her own voice and tried to soften it. "Or perhaps it's people everywhere. We're comfortable with charity as long as the recipients know their place and act appropriately grateful. You don't strike me as someone comfortable with charity." "I'm not." The admission came out fiercer than she intended. "I want to work, to contribute, to build something, like you said. I don't want to be a burden or a decoration or a convenient solution to someone else's problem." Ethan reined Duke to a stop at the crest of a hill, and Clara pulled Copper up beside him. Below them, nestled in a valley with a creek running through it, was a house. It was simple. Single story, wood frame, with a stone chimney at one end and a covered porch across the front. Not grand, but solid. Real. Behind it stood a barn and several outbuildings, and Clara could see cattle grazing in the distance, their shapes dark against the golden grass. "That's it," Ethan said, and she heard both pride and uncertainty in his voice. "That's what I'm offering. It's not much compared to what you might have had." "It's more than I have now," Clara interrupted. "And it's honest. That's worth something." They rode down into the valley, and as they got closer, Clara could see the details. The porch needed some boards replaced. One of the windows had a crack running through it. The barn door hung slightly crooked, but the roof looked sound, the chimney was well built, and someone had planted roses along the porch rail, wild now, but still blooming with fierce determination. "My mother sent those," Ethan said, following her gaze to the roses. "First year I was here. Said every house needs something beautiful to remind you why you're working so hard." He helped her down from Copper, and Clara stood for a moment, taking it all in. The air smelled different here, sage and grass and water, clean in a way Boston air never was. The creek burbled over stones, and somewhere a bird was singing a melody she didn't recognize. "Would you like to see inside?" Ethan asked. Clara nodded, and he led her up the porch steps. The door wasn't locked. She noticed there wasn't even a lock, just a simple latch. Inside, the house was dim and cool after the bright morning sun. One large room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace at one end and a simple kitchen setup at the other. 2 doors led off the main room, bedroom and storage, Clara guessed. The furniture was handmade but sturdy, a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, shelves lined with supplies, flour, coffee, canned goods. Everything was neat, almost militarily organized, the home of a man living alone who'd learned to take care of himself. "Bedroom's through there," Ethan said, nodding at one of the doors but not opening it. "I'd sleep in the barn if you decided to stay, until..." He stopped, seeming uncomfortable for the first time. "Until we figured things out properly." The implication hung between them, heavy with everything they weren't saying. Marriage would mean sharing that room eventually, becoming truly husband and wife. Clara felt her cheeks burn and looked away, focusing on the kitchen area. "Do you cook for yourself?" she asked, more to fill the silence than because she needed to know. "I do." Nothing fancy. Beans, cornbread, bacon when I have it. Coffee strong enough to strip paint. He moved to the kitchen area, running a hand over the simple wooden counter. I know it's not what you're used to. No servants, no fine china, no drawing room for entertaining. It's just life. Simple and hard and honest. Mr. Cole, Clara said carefully, I haven't had servants since I was 17. I've cooked my own meals, washed my own clothes, and scrubbed my own floors. I'm not afraid of work. I'm only afraid of making a mistake I can't undo. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. That's wise. This would be a mistake if you're looking for something I can't give. I can't promise you comfort or luxury or an easy life. I can't promise I'll always say the right thing or understand what you need. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But I can promise I won't lie to you. I won't abandon you. And I won't treat you like you're less than a full partner in whatever we build here. Why? The question burst out of Clara before she could stop it. Why me? You could place your own advertisement, find someone you've corresponded with, someone you've chosen. Why make this offer to a complete stranger? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and Clara watched the sunlight filtering through the cracked window play across his face. When he spoke, his voice was low and honest. Because I know what it's like to be cast aside. My father made it clear I wasn't worth investing in. Youngest son, nothing special, better to focus on the older boys who'd inherit. I know what it feels like to be told you're not good enough, that someone else is a better choice. He met her eyes. When I saw you standing in that street yesterday, replaced before you'd even arrived, I saw something I recognized, and I thought, if I could offer you what no one offered me when I needed it most, a real choice, a fair chance, then maybe some good could come from all this. Clara's throat tightened. That's either the kindest thing anyone's ever done for me or the most foolish. Probably both. A hint of a smile touched his mouth. I'm not claiming to be smart about this. Just honest. A sound from outside made them both turn. Hoofbeats approaching fast. Through the window, Clara saw a small wagon pulling up, driven by a woman in an elaborate dress that seemed absurdly formal for a Tuesday morning ranch visit. Ethan's expression darkened. That's Evelyn Cartwright, Mitchell's new wife. Clara's stomach dropped. She wasn't ready for this confrontation. Not here, not now. But Ethan touched her arm gently. You don't have to face her if you don't want to. I can send her away. No. Clara straightened her shoulders, reaching for that core of steel her mother had always said she possessed. I won't hide. I've done nothing wrong. They stepped out onto the porch together as Evelyn climbed down from her wagon. She was handsome rather than pretty, probably in her mid-30s, with an air of prosperity that showed in every detail of her dress and manner. Her eyes swept over Clara with the kind of assessment women reserve for competition, then dismissed her with visible satisfaction. Mr. Cole? Evelyn said, her voice sugary and false. I heard you had a visitor. Thought I should stop by and introduce myself properly to poor Miss Whitmore. Mrs. Mitchell, Ethan said, his tone flat and unwelcoming. This is private property. You're not invited. Oh, don't be rude, Ethan. We're all neighbors here. Evelyn turned to Clara, and her smile was sharp as a knife. Miss Whitmore, I wanted to speak with you about your situation. My husband feels terrible about the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Clara's voice came out harder than she intended. Is that what we're calling it? Evelyn's smile didn't waver. Well, you must understand, dear. Robert and I have history. We courted years ago before his first wife. When I returned to Henderson after my own husband's passing, it was only natural that old feelings would resurface. Surely you can't blame a man for choosing true love over a convenient arrangement with a stranger. The words were designed to wound, and they did. But Clara held her ground, refusing to flinch. I don't blame Mr. Mitchell for his feelings. I blame him for his cowardice in not informing me before I made a 3-week journey based on promises he'd already broken. How dramatic! Evelyn's laugh was light and condescending. You mail-order brides are all the same. So desperate for a husband you'll cross the country on a stranger's word, then act surprised when men have second thoughts. Really, dear, you should be grateful you learned the truth before the wedding. Think of the embarrassment you've been spared. That's enough, Ethan said, his voice dangerous. Say what you came to say and leave. Evelyn's expression hardened, the false sweetness falling away. Fine. I came to offer Miss Whitmore a position. My household needs a girl, someone to help with cleaning, laundry, kitchen work. I'm willing to pay fair wages and provide room and board. It's honest work, respectable. Certainly better than whatever arrangement you're considering here. The insult was clear. Better to be a servant in Evelyn's house than Ethan's wife. Clara felt rage building in her chest, hot and fierce. Let me understand this correctly, Clara said, her voice cold and precise. Your husband promised to marry me. While I was traveling to honor that promise, he married you instead. And now you're offering me the privilege of scrubbing your floors and washing your husband's shirts? I'm offering you employment, Evelyn said primly, which is more than you'll find elsewhere in this town. No one else will hire you, not with your reputation. The rejected bride, the woman not good enough for Robert Mitchell. Who'd want that kind of scandal in their household? Mrs. Mitchell, Clara said quietly, and something in her tone made Evelyn's triumphant expression falter. I may have been rejected by your husband, but I was also deemed worthy by him once. You, on the other hand, have apparently spent years waiting for him to notice you again, desperate enough to snatch him up the moment he was available. Which of us, I wonder, is truly the desperate one? Evelyn's face flushed an ugly red. How dare you? You came to my potential home to insult me and offer me charity disguised as employment. I dare quite a lot, as it turns out. Clara stepped forward, and Evelyn actually stepped back. Tell your husband I don't want his compensation, and tell him that the woman he replaced is doing quite well without him. You think Ethan Cole is going to marry you? Evelyn's voice turned vicious. He's using you, you foolish girl. He needs a wife to prove up his land claim, and you're convenient. Once he has his title, he'll cast you aside just like Robert did. Men like him don't actually want educated Eastern women. They want broodmares who know their place. Get off my land, Ethan said, his voice so cold it made Clara shiver. Now! Gladly. Evelyn climbed back into her wagon, but couldn't resist one last parting shot. When he abandons you, don't come begging to me for that position. I won't offer twice. She snapped the reins and drove away, leaving dust and tension in her wake. Clara stood frozen on the porch, shaking with anger and residual fear. Ethan moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the solid presence of him, but not touching. Is it true? Clara asked quietly. About the land claim? Do you need a wife to prove it up? No. Ethan's answer was immediate and firm. I need to maintain residence and demonstrate improvement. A wife would make it easier maybe, but it's not required. The land will be mine next spring regardless. Clara wanted to believe him, but Evelyn's poison had done its work. How do I know you're not just saying what I want to hear? How do I know you're any different from Mitchell? Ethan turned to face her fully. You don't. You can't. That's the hell of it, Miss Whitmore. You have to decide if you trust me based on nothing but your own judgment and a day's acquaintance. I can't prove myself in advance. I can only give you my word, and I know exactly how much that's worth to you right now. He paused, his gray eyes steady on hers. But I'll tell you this. You can ride into town right now. Ask anyone about me. Ask if I've ever broken my word. Ask if I've ever treated anyone unfairly. Ask what kind of man I am. Their answers might not convince you, but at least you'll have more information than just my say-so. It was the honesty more than anything else that got through to Clara. He wasn't trying to charm her or convince her or make false promises. He was simply telling her the truth as he saw it and leaving the decision in her hands. I don't know what to do, she admitted, and the confession felt like failure. I came here for certainty, for a clear path, and instead everything is confusion. Life's like that sometimes. Ethan's voice was gentle. The clear paths often lead nowhere good. It's the uncertain ones that take you somewhere worth going. Clara looked out at the valley, at the house and barn, and the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. She thought about Boston and poverty and aging relatives who saw her as a burden. She thought about Robert Mitchell and Evelyn's cruel smile. She thought about scrubbing floors in the house of the man who'd rejected her, watching him live the life he'd promised to her. And she thought about Ethan Cole, who'd offered her dignity when everyone else offered charity or contempt. I need time, she said finally. I can't decide something this important this quickly. Take all the time you need, Ethan said. The offer stands. A week, a month, however long you need to be sure. And if I decide against it, then I'll help you figure out what comes next. Maybe there's work in town, or another town where you could teach again. Maybe there's family somewhere who'd take you in. Whatever it is, I'll help you find it. You're not alone in this, Miss Whitmore. Not anymore. The kindness in his words nearly broke her composure. Clara blinked hard against sudden tears, refusing to cry in front of him again. Why are you being so good to me? Because someone should be, Ethan said simply, and because I think you deserve better than what you've gotten so far. They rode back to town in thoughtful silence, and Clara's mind churned with possibilities and fears. When they reached the livery stable, Ethan helped her down from Copper with the same careful courtesy he'd shown all day. Thank you for showing me your home, Clara said formally. I'll consider everything carefully. That's all I ask. He hesitated, then added, Miss Whitmore, Clara, if I may, whatever you decide, I hope you'll decide based on what you want, not on what you think you should want or what other people expect. Your life should be yours to choose. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice, and walked back toward the boarding house. She could feel eyes watching her from windows and doorways, could sense the gossip already forming, the rejected bride visiting the cowboy's ranch. What did that mean? What would happen next? Let them wonder, Clara thought with sudden fierceness. Let them speculate and gossip and make their judgments. She would make her choice based on her own assessment, her own needs, her own future. And whatever that choice turned out to be, it would be genuinely hers. For a woman who'd spent her whole life having her path determined by others, that freedom was both terrifying and intoxicating. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Clara caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror and stopped. The woman looking back at her had wind-blown hair and color in her cheeks from the ride. She looked alive in a way she hadn't in months, maybe years. She looked like someone making her own choices. And Clara Whitmore smiled. That evening, Clara sat at the small desk in her boarding house room with paper and pen borrowed from Helen, trying to make a practical assessment of her situation. She'd always been good with numbers, with organizing information into clear columns that revealed the truth of things. But tonight, the numbers kept blurring as her mind wandered back to the valley, to the house with the crooked barn door and wild roses, to gray eyes that looked at her like she was worth something. She forced herself to focus, writing out her options with deliberate precision. Option 1. Accept Robert Mitchell's compensation and return to Boston. She calculated the funds carefully, enough for perhaps 3 months of modest living if she was careful. Then what? The teaching position was closed to her. Her relatives had made their position clear. She could seek work as a governess, perhaps, or a companion to some wealthy widow, but those positions required references she no longer had. The daughter of a man who died in debt, the woman desperate enough to become a mail-order bride, these were not recommendations that opened doors in Boston society. Option 2. Stay in Henderson and find work. But Evelyn's words, cruel as they were, held truth. The town was small, opportunities limited, and she would always be the rejected bride, the woman Robert Mitchell found wanting. Every day would be a reminder of her failure, her inadequacy. She'd be living in the shadow of her own humiliation. Option 3. Accept Ethan Cole's proposal. Clara's pen hovered over the paper, unable to write the practical assessment this option required. Because how did you calculate the value of dignity? How did you measure the worth of a man who offered partnership instead of charity, who looked at her ruin and saw possibility? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Helen entered with a lamp, chasing back the gathering darkness. Getting late, Helen said, setting the lamp on the bedside table. Thought you might need some light, and some company if you want it. I'm trying to think clearly, Clara admitted, but all I can manage is confusion. Helen settled into the room's only chair with a sigh of relief. My feet are killing me. Been on them since dawn. She studied Clara with shrewd, kind eyes. You went out to Ethan's place today. What did you think? I think it's honest, simple, hard work, and no pretense. That's Ethan in a nutshell, Helen agreed. What you see is what you get with that man. No hidden agendas, no sweet talk, just straightforward dealing. Mrs. Brennan, Clara said carefully, may I ask you something? As someone who knows this town, who knows these people, do you think I'd be making a terrible mistake if I accepted his offer? Helen was quiet for a long moment, her weathered face thoughtful in the lamplight. I think you'd be making a different life than the one you planned. Whether that's terrible or wonderful depends on what you're looking for. She leaned forward. Can I tell you something about Ethan Cole? Something most folks don't know? Clara nodded, setting down her pen. 3 years ago, a family came through town, homesteaders heading further west. They got caught in a bad storm, wagon broke down, the father got pneumonia. They had 4 children, no money, nowhere to go. The church took up a collection, but it wasn't enough. You know who showed up at their camp with a month's worth of supplies? Ethan. Didn't make a show of it, didn't want thanks, just loaded up his wagon and left it there in the night. The father found out later and tried to pay him back. Ethan refused, said a man helps when help's needed, that's all. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Why are you telling me this? Because you're trying to decide if you can trust him. And I'm telling you that Ethan Cole's word is gold. If he says he'll treat you right, he will. If he promises partnership, he means it. Helen paused. But that doesn't mean it'll be easy. Ranch life is hard, especially for a woman used to city living. You'll work dawn to dusk. Your hands will blister and your back will ache. You'll be miles from town, from other women, from anything resembling society. You'll birth babies with only Ethan to help because the doctor's 3 hours away on a good day. That's the truth of it, and you should know what you're choosing. I'm not afraid of hard work, Clara said quietly. No, I don't think you are. Helen smiled. But there's a difference between being willing to work and understanding what frontier life actually demands. Take another day. Go back out there, but this time ask him the hard questions. Ask about money, about winters, about what happens if the cattle die or the creek runs dry. Ask about children and loneliness and what he expects from a wife. Get the full picture before you decide. It was good advice, practical and honest. Clara thanked Helen and returned to her list, but now she was writing different questions. Not calculations of money or probability, but the real questions that would determine whether she could build a life with a stranger in a wild place. Sleep came late and restless, full of dreams where she stood at crossroads that stretched in impossible directions, each path disappearing into fog. Morning brought clarity, if not certainty. Clara dressed in her simplest dress and walked to the general store, where the proprietor, a balding man named Harris, looked at her with cautious sympathy. Help you, miss? I need to send a telegram, Clara said. To Boston. She composed the message carefully, addressing it to her father's former solicitor, one of the few people who'd shown her genuine kindness after his death. The message was brief. Situation changed. Marriage canceled. Considering alternative arrangement. Please advise on legal necessities for frontier marriage. Reply Henderson, Texas. It cost more than she wanted to spend, but she needed information from someone she could trust. If she was going to make this decision, she would make it with her eyes fully open. She spent the rest of the morning walking through Henderson, really seeing it for the first time. It was smaller than she'd realized in yesterday's shock. One main street, perhaps 24 buildings, and scattered houses spreading out into the surrounding grassland. The church was simple but well maintained. White paint bright in the morning sun. The school was tiny, maybe room for 20 children. She saw the post office, the bank, a dress shop that looked like it survived on hope more than customers. And everywhere, people watched her. Some nodded politely. Others whispered behind their hands. One woman, young, probably Clara's age, heavily pregnant, smiled at her with genuine warmth. You're Miss Whitmore, the woman said, approaching with the awkward waddle of late pregnancy. I'm Sarah Jenkins. My husband runs the freight office. She gestured at her swollen belly with a rueful smile. Baby's due in 3 weeks, and I'm about ready to be done with this part. Congratulations, Clara said, grateful for a friendly face. Listen, I know everyone's gossiping about you, and it's probably awful. Small towns are the worst for that. Sarah lowered her voice conspiratorially. But for what it's worth, I think Bobby Mitchell's an ass and Ethan Cole's a good man. If you're considering his offer, don't let the busybodies scare you off. We need more women here with actual backbone. The The frank support caught Clara off guard. Thank you. That's very kind. Not kind, just honest. Look, if you do stay, come find me. I could use a friend who can discuss something other than crops and cattle prices. Sarah grinned. And if you can read, even better. I'm desperate for someone to talk books with. They parted with promises to visit, and Clara continued her exploration feeling slightly less alone. She was beginning to understand that Henderson, like anywhere else, contained multitudes. There were the Evelyns who would judge and condemn, but also the Sarahs who would extend friendship despite scandal. The question was which group would dominate her experience if she stayed. By afternoon, she'd made another decision. She returned to the livery stable where the same young man from yesterday was mucking out stalls. Help you, miss? Is Mr. Cole in town today? No, ma'am. He's out at his place, but he said if you came by I should tell you you're welcome to ride out whenever you want. Copper's here if you need her. Clara hesitated only briefly. She'd ridden to the ranch yesterday. She could do it again. And Helen was right. She needed to ask the hard questions, the ones that would reveal whether this arrangement could actually work. The ride was easier this time, her body remembering the rhythm despite the soreness from yesterday. The land seemed different in the afternoon light, gold and amber instead of morning's softer tones. She saw a hawk circling overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace. A jackrabbit bounded away from Copper's hooves, disappearing into the tall grass. The sheer space of it still took her breath, so much open land, so much sky. She found Ethan in the barn repairing a section of fence. He looked up at her approach, surprise and something else, hope, maybe, crossing his face. Miss Whitmore? Didn't expect to see you today. I have questions, Clara said, dismounting without waiting for his help. Mrs. Brennan said I should ask you the hard ones before I decide, so I'm asking. Ethan set down his tools and wiped his hands on his work pants. Fair enough. Ask whatever you need. Clara pulled out the list she'd written that morning, her teacher's training demanding organization even in chaos. First, money. What are your actual finances? Can this ranch support 2 people? What happens in bad years? If her directness surprised him, Ethan didn't show it. I've got $800 in the bank. Paid off my equipment last year, so no debts. The cattle are worth maybe $2,000 if I sold them all, but that's my breeding stock, so I won't unless it's desperate. In a good year, I clear about $600 profit after expenses. Bad year, maybe $200, maybe nothing. He met her eyes steadily. It's enough to live on if you're careful. We won't starve, won't lose the land. But we won't be rich either. New dresses will be rare, luxuries rarer. Clara wrote his answers down, appreciating the specifics. What about children? If we have them, can you support a family? With work? Yes. The ranch can grow. I've got grazing rights on another 200 acres I could purchase eventually. More cattle means more income. But you'd be doing a lot of the work yourself. No hired help, no nanny. Any children we have, we raise them together while working the ranch. What do you expect from a wife? Specifically. Ethan thought about that, choosing his words carefully. Honesty. Partnership. Someone who'll work beside me, not behind me. Help with the cattle during calving season. Manage the house and garden. Handle the accounts if you're good with numbers. I am, but I'd rather be doing other things. Cook, clean, mend. The same things any ranch wife does. He paused. But I also expect you to speak your mind. Tell me when I'm wrong. Make decisions about your own domain without asking permission for every little thing. I want a partner, Clara, not a servant. The use of her first name sent a small shiver through her. And if I can't do something, if I fail at ranch work, then we figure it out together. I don't expect you to know everything from the start. I'll teach you what I can. You'll learn the rest. His voice gentled. I'm not looking for perfection, just honest effort. Clara consulted her list again. What about loneliness? Mrs. Brennan said I'd be miles from town, from other women. What happens when I'm desperate for conversation that isn't about cattle? We go to town, every Sunday for church if you want, more often if you need it, and Sarah Jenkins is only 2 miles south. Her husband's place borders mine. She's good people, could use a friend. Ethan leaned against the fence, his expression serious. But I won't lie to you. Winter nights are long and quiet. Sometimes you'll go days without seeing anyone but me. If you need constant company, constant stimulation, you'll go mad out here. What about you? Clara asked, deviating from her list. What do you need? What are you looking for in a wife besides someone to share the work? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and Clara watched him wrestle with the answer. Companionship, he said finally. Someone to talk to at the end of the day. Someone who makes the house feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. Someone who... He stopped, then started again. My parents had a good marriage. Not fancy, not romantic like in books, but solid. They worked together, respected each other, built something that lasted. That's what I want. That kind of partnership. Not love? Love's a fine thing if it comes, but it's not required for a good marriage. Respect is. Trust is. Shared purpose is. He looked at her directly. If love comes later, that's a gift. But I won't demand it from you, and I won't lie and claim I feel it now. How could I? We barely know each other. The honesty was refreshing and terrifying in equal measure. Clara had been raised on novels where love conquered all, where passion was the foundation of marriage. But she'd also seen her parents' marriage, affectionate, practical, based more on mutual regard than grand romance. Which model was more realistic? Which was more likely to last? One more question, Clara said, her throat tight. If I agree to this, if we marry, and then you meet someone you actually want to marry for love, what happens then? Ethan's expression hardened. I'm not Bobby Mitchell. If I make a vow, I keep it. Marriage means something to me. It's not a temporary arrangement I can discard when something better comes along. He stepped closer, his voice intense. If you marry me, Clara, you're stuck with me. For better or worse, like the vows say, I won't abandon you, I won't replace you, I won't betray you. That's a promise. Clara felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. How do I know that's true? You can't. Not for certain. Ethan's voice was gentle now. That's the risk you take with any marriage. But I can tell you this, my word is all I've got out here. It's the only currency that matters on the frontier. If I break my word to you, I'm worth nothing, not just to you, but to everyone. That's not a risk I'd take lightly. Clara folded her list carefully, buying time to compose herself. Every answer he'd given had been direct, honest, practical. No false promises, no romantic nonsense. Just the truth as he saw it, offered plainly for her consideration. I need to think about everything, she said finally, but I appreciate your honesty. Take all the time you need. Ethan hesitated, then added, Would you like to stay for supper? Nothing fancy, but you should know if my cooking's bearable before you commit to a lifetime of it. The offer surprised a laugh out of Clara. Is this a test? Maybe for both of us. His smile was slight but genuine. You can see how I actually live, not just the cleaned-up version, and I can see if you run screaming after eating my attempts at biscuits. It was a terrible idea by any measure of propriety. Being alone with him at his ranch, sharing a meal unchaperoned, it was exactly the kind of behavior that ruined reputations. But Clara's reputation was already ruined, wasn't it? That's why she was here in the first place. All right, she said, but I reserve the right to offer cooking advice. I'd be grateful for it. They worked together to prepare the meal, and Clara found herself falling into an easy rhythm beside him. Ethan moved around the kitchen with practical efficiency, no wasted motion, and he didn't hover or try to prevent her from helping. When she reached for the flour to make proper biscuits, he simply stepped aside and let her work. Where did you learn to cook? Clara asked, kneading dough on the simple wooden counter. My mother insisted all her children know the basics, said she wouldn't raise sons who couldn't feed themselves or daughters who couldn't change a wagon wheel. Practical woman, my mother. He was cutting salt pork at the stove, adding it to a pot of beans. What about you? I learned after my father died. The housekeeper tried to teach me, but she left when we couldn't pay her anymore. After that, it was learn or starve. Clara shaped the biscuits with practiced hands. I burned a lot of meals at first, ruined 3 pots before I figured out how to manage the heat. But you kept trying. I didn't have much choice. That's when you learn the most, Ethan said quietly. When there's no choice but to figure it out. They ate at the simple table as the sun set, painting the sky outside the windows in shades of orange and purple that Clara had never seen in Boston's gray evenings. The food was plain: beans, salt pork, her biscuits that had turned out better than expected, coffee that was indeed strong enough to strip paint. But it was good in its simplicity, honest and filling. "Tell me about your family," Clara said, surprising herself. "You mentioned 7 brothers, 2 sisters. What are they like?" Ethan smiled, and it transformed his face. "Loud, chaotic, always in each other's business. My oldest brother Thomas runs the family farm now. He's steady, responsible, everything my father wanted. Michael's a blacksmith, got a shop in Oklahoma City. Patrick joined the cavalry, always wanted adventure. The others are scattered, farming, ranching. One's even a banker in St. Louis." He took a sip of coffee. "My sisters both married local boys, have big families of their own. I see them when I can, but it's not often." "Do you miss them?" "Sometimes, especially at holidays. But I don't miss the crowding, the constant noise, the way there was never enough of anything to go around." He studied her face in the lamplight. "What about you? Any family left?" "No one close. My mother died when I was 12. My father had a brother in Philadelphia, but we were never close to that side of the family. After father died, they made it clear I was an inconvenience they wouldn't shoulder." Clara heard the bitterness in her voice and tried to soften it. "I had friends once, before the scandal of poverty made me unmarriageable. They all drifted away." "Their loss," Ethan said simply. They washed the dishes together, another easy partnership that felt oddly natural. Clara found herself watching his hands as he worked, scarred and calloused, but careful with the simple plates. Hands that had built a house, tended cattle, offered her dignity when everyone else offered contempt. "It's getting dark," Ethan said eventually. "I should ride back with you. Not safe to travel alone at twilight. I don't want to take you away from your work." "You're not." He was already moving toward the door. "Besides, it's not a request. I'm riding with you." They made the journey back to Henderson in comfortable silence, the stars beginning to emerge overhead in a display that made Clara's breath catch. She'd never seen so many stars, the sky so vast and clear. In Boston, city lights dimmed everything. But here, the darkness was complete except for the brilliant scatter of light above. At the livery stable, Ethan helped her down from Copper and walked her to the boarding house. At the porch steps, he stopped. "Thank you for coming today," he said, "for asking the hard questions, for being honest about what you need to know." "Thank you for answering them," Clara replied, "for not trying to paint everything in false colors." "Clara." The sound of her name in his rough voice made her look up. "Whatever you decide, I mean what I said. If you choose to leave, I'll help you. If you choose to stay but not marry me, I'll help you find work, find a place. You're not alone in this." The kindness threatened to break her composure. "Why do you care? Truly, I need to understand." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his face shadowed in the darkness. "Because everyone deserves someone in their corner, because I know what it's like to feel disposable, and because—" He stopped, then continued quietly. "Because when I look at you, I see someone strong enough to survive what would break most people. That's worth something. That's worth fighting for." Clara stood frozen as he tipped his hat and walked away, his figure disappearing into the darkness. She climbed the stairs to her room in a daze, her mind churning with everything he'd said, everything she'd learned. She found a telegram waiting on her desk. The solicitor had replied with remarkable speed. The message was brief. "Frontier marriage legal if properly witnessed and recorded. Ensure contract specifies property rights. Recommend separate agreement regarding assets. Can draft if needed." Clara sat down heavily, the telegram in her hand. It was all becoming too real. Not a fantasy or a desperate dream, but an actual possibility with legal implications and permanent consequences. She pulled out fresh paper and began writing again, but this time not a list of practical considerations. Instead, she wrote the truth as she understood it. "I came to Texas expecting one kind of trap, marriage to a stranger who needed a wife for practical reasons. Instead, I found a different kind of choice entirely. Ethan Cole is offering me partnership, not rescue. Dignity, not charity. A hard life, yes, but an honest one. With him, I would work until my hands blistered and my back ached. I would face loneliness and hardship and winter storms. I would birth children without doctors and build a life without guarantees. But I would be building something, with someone who looks at me like I matter, Someone whose word actually means something. Is that enough? Can respect and partnership substitute for love? Can honest effort replace passion? Or am I just trading one kind of desperation for another? Clara set down the pen and walked to the window. Somewhere out in the darkness, Ethan was riding home to his ranch, to the house he'd built with his own hands. Tomorrow he would wake before dawn and work until sunset, building something that would be his legacy. And he'd offered to share that legacy with her, not because he loved her, not because she was beautiful or accomplished or brought him wealth, but because she'd been cast aside and he understood what that felt like, because she was brave enough to cross the country on faith, because he believed she deserved a choice. Claire pressed her forehead against the cool glass and made her decision, not based on calculations or practical considerations or fear of the alternatives, but based on something deeper, something she was only beginning to understand. She would accept Ethan Cole's proposal, not because she had no other choice, but because she was choosing him. Choosing the hard work and the honesty and the possibility of building something real with someone who saw her as an equal. It was terrifying and exhilarating and felt more right than anything had felt in a very long time. Tomorrow, she would tell him. Tomorrow, her new life would begin. But tonight, Clara Whitmore stood at her window and looked out at the Texas stars, feeling for the first time since her father's death that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Morning came too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Clara had barely slept, her mind replaying the decision she'd made in the darkness, testing it from every angle, searching for the flaw that would prove she was making another terrible mistake. But each time she circled back to the same conclusion, this felt right in a way that nothing else had. She dressed with deliberate care in her best remaining dress, a deep green cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. If she was going to accept a marriage proposal, she would do it looking like a woman who knew her own worth, not a desperate refugee grateful for scraps. Helen was in the kitchen when Clara came down, preparing breakfast for her handful of boarders. She took one look at Clara's face and set down her mixing spoon. "You've decided," Helen said quietly. "I have." Clara's voice was steady, surer than she felt. "I'm going to accept Mr. Cole's proposal." Helen studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're certain? You've thought it through?" "As much as anyone can think through marrying a stranger." Clara managed a small smile. "But yes, I'm certain." "Then you'll need help preparing." Helen wiped her hands on her apron, her expression shifting from concern to practical efficiency. "A wedding, even a simple one, requires proper arrangements, and we need to make sure you understand what you're entering into, legally speaking. I received a telegram from my father's solicitor. He mentioned contracts, property rights." "Smart man." Helen poured 2 cups of coffee and gestured for Clara to sit. "Listen to me carefully, because this matters. Texas law gives married women some rights, but not enough. If you're going into this marriage, you need protections. An agreement that specifies what happens if Ethan dies, or if he, God forbid, turns out different than he seems. An agreement that ensures you're not left destitute if things go wrong." Clara hadn't thought that far ahead, and the reminder sent a chill through her. "Do you think Ethan would object to such an agreement? If he's the man I think he is, he'll insist on it himself." Helen sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "A good man wants his wife protected. A bad man wants her dependent. We'll know which he is by how he responds." They spent the next hour discussing practicalities that made Clara's head spin: property rights, inheritance laws, the legal requirements for frontier marriages. Helen produced papers she'd saved from her own wedding decades ago, showing Clara the kind of language that protected a woman's interests. "You take these to Ethan," Helen said, pressing the documents into Clara's hands. "Tell him you want a proper agreement drawn up before the wedding. See what he says." Clara folded the papers carefully and tucked them into her reticule. "Mrs. Brennan, why are you helping me? You barely know me." Helen's expression softened. "Because 30 years ago, I was you. Not a mail-order bride, but close enough. Married a man I'd known 3 weeks because the alternative was going back east to family who didn't want me. My William turned out to be a good man, but it could have gone differently. I learned the hard way that women need to protect themselves, need to look out for each other." She squeezed Clara's hand. "So I'm looking out for you, making sure you're going into this with your eyes open and your rights protected." Clara felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Thank you, truly. Don't thank me yet. Thank me after you're settled and happy. Helen stood, returning to her breakfast preparations. Now go. Ethan usually comes to town on Wednesday mornings for supplies. You'll likely find him at the general store within the hour. Clara walked to the general store with her heart hammering against her ribs. The morning was already warm, the sun climbing steadily in that vast Texas sky. The town was beginning to stir, shopkeepers opening their doors, women heading to the market, men gathering outside the saloon to discuss cattle prices and weather. She saw the stares, heard the whispers cut off as she passed. Let them talk. By this time tomorrow she'd be married, and their gossip would become fact. The rejected mail-order bride who married the cowboy. It would give them something to discuss for months. Ethan's horse was tied outside the general store when she arrived, and through the window she could see him inside, talking with Mr. Harris about flour or coffee or whatever supplies a rancher needed. Clara paused at the threshold, gathering her courage. This was it. Once she walked through that door and spoke the words, there would be no taking them back. She stepped inside. Ethan looked up at the sound of the door, and something in his expression shifted when he saw her. Not quite hope, but a careful attention that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced since her father died. Miss Whitmore, he said, touching his hat brim in that courtly gesture that seemed so incongruous with his rough appearance. Didn't expect to see you this morning. Mr. Cole, might I speak with you, privately? Mr. Harris made a show of suddenly needing to check inventory in the back room, leaving them alone in the store. Clara was grateful for the discretion, even if she knew he'd have his ear pressed to the door. I've made my decision, Clara said without preamble, about your proposal. Ethan went very still, his gray eyes fixed on her face. And? I accept. I'll marry you, if the offer still stands. For a moment he didn't react at all, and Clara felt panic flutter in her chest. Had he changed his mind? Had she waited too long? But then something shifted in his expression. Relief, wonder, something she couldn't quite name. It stands, he said quietly. It absolutely stands. Clara pulled the papers from her reticule with hands that trembled slightly. However, I have conditions. Mrs. Brennan helped me understand some things about frontier marriages, about protecting women's rights. I want a formal agreement drawn up before the wedding, specifying property rights, inheritance. What happens if you predecease me, or if the marriage fails? She held out the papers. I need to know I'm entering into a partnership, not making myself completely dependent on your goodwill. Ethan took the papers and read through them carefully, his expression serious. Clara watched him, her stomach tight with anxiety. This was the test Helen had mentioned. A good man would understand. A bad man would be insulted. When he looked up, his eyes met hers steadily. These are fair terms, more than fair. We'll ride to the county seat this afternoon, get a proper lawyer to draw up an agreement that protects both of us. He paused. Clara, I want you to have protections. I want you to know that if something happens to me, you'll be secure. That's not negotiable from my side either. The relief was so intense it made her dizzy. Thank you. Don't thank me for doing what's right. He folded the papers carefully. When do you want to do this? The wedding, I mean. As soon as possible. Clara felt her cheeks warm. I know that sounds hasty, but the longer we wait, the more difficult it becomes. The gossip, the speculation, the way people look at me. I'd rather be married and settled than in this limbo. Friday, Ethan said decisively. That gives us 2 days to get the legal agreement done, arrange for a preacher, handle the necessities. We'll marry Friday afternoon, and then... He stopped, seeming suddenly uncertain. Then we figure out the rest as we go. Friday, Clara agreed, and the word felt both like a promise and a precipice. They rode to the county seat that afternoon, a larger town 20 miles east where a proper lawyer maintained an office above the bank. Mr. Thornton was an older man with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner that Clara appreciated immediately. Prenuptial agreement for a frontier marriage, he said, reading through Helen's papers. Smart thinking. I've seen too many widows left destitute because nothing was formalized. He looked at Ethan over his spectacles. You're agreeable to this, Mr. Cole? Completely. I want Mrs. Cole to be protected. Ethan stumbled slightly over the name that would soon be Clara's, and she felt a strange flutter in her chest at hearing it. If something happens to me, the ranch should be hers outright. No questions, no contest from my family. And in the event of marital dissolution? Mr. Thornton's pen was poised over paper. Clara and Ethan exchanged glances. Won't happen, Ethan said firmly. But if it did, Clara keeps half of everything we build together from the date of marriage. I won't leave her with nothing. They spent 2 hours working through details that made Clara's head spin: property rights, inheritance laws, provisions for potential children, specifications about livestock and land and assets neither of them actually had yet. But by the end, she had a legal document that protected her interests and spelled out exactly what she was entitled to as Ethan's wife. One more thing, Mr. Thornton said as they prepared to leave. Mrs. Whitmore, are you entering into this marriage of your own free will? No coercion, no undue influence? Yes, Clara said clearly, completely of my own free will. Good. He stamped the documents with official seals. Then I wish you both the very best. Marriage is hard work, but it can be good work if both parties are committed. They rode back to Henderson in the golden light of late afternoon, and Clara found herself studying Ethan's profile as he guided Duke along the dusty road. In 2 days, this man would be her husband. They would stand before a preacher and make vows that would bind them for life. She would share his name, his home, his bed, eventually. The thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. What are you thinking? Ethan asked, catching her looking at him. Clara decided on honesty, that I'm about to marry a man I've known less than a week, that I must be either very brave or very foolish. Could be both. His mouth quirked in that almost smile. I'm thinking the same thing, if it helps. Wondering if I've lost my mind, proposing to a woman I don't know based on nothing but instinct. Does it feel right to you, this decision? Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. It feels right enough. Feels like a chance at something good, if we're both willing to work for it. He glanced at her. What about you? It feels terrifying, but also like the first real choice I've made in years. Like I'm taking control of my own life instead of letting circumstances control me. Clara paused. I think that's worth the risk. Then we're agreed. We're both terrified and choosing this anyway. They arrived back in Henderson as the sun touched the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. Ethan escorted her to the boarding house, where Helen was waiting on the porch with barely contained curiosity. Well? Helen demanded as soon as Ethan had ridden away. Friday afternoon, Clara said, and couldn't stop the smile that spread across her face. We're getting married Friday afternoon. Helen let out a whoop that made several passers-by turn and stare. Then we have work to do. A dress to prepare, arrangements to make, proper food for afterward because you can't celebrate a wedding on beans and cornbread. She ushered Clara inside, already making lists in her head. Sarah Jenkins will want to help. She mentioned you to me earlier, said you seemed like good people. And Pastor Wilson will need to be informed, and we need to make sure you have proper things for setting up house. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity that left Clara's head spinning. Helen threw herself into preparations with the enthusiasm of a general planning a military campaign. Sarah Jenkins arrived the next morning, pregnancy and all, declaring that Clara needed at least one friend standing up with her at the wedding. Even frontier weddings deserve witnesses who actually care about the bride, Sarah said firmly, settling herself into a chair with a grunt of relief. My feet are the size of melons and I can't see my own toes anymore, but I'll be there. Together, they worked on Clara's wedding dress, taking her best remaining gown and altering it with lace borrowed from Sarah and ribbons Helen produced from mysterious sources. It wouldn't rival Boston fashions, but it would be respectable. More importantly, it would be hers, made by women who were becoming friends. Tell me about Ethan Cole, Clara said as they sewed. Really, tell me. I'm marrying him in 2 days and I feel like I barely know him. Sarah and Helen exchanged glances. What do you want to know? Sarah asked. Everything, anything. What people really think of him, not just the polite things they say to my face. Helen set down her needle. All right. Honestly, people respect Ethan. He keeps his word, pays his debts, helps neighbors when they need it, but he's not exactly social. Doesn't come to town gatherings much, doesn't drink with the other ranchers, keeps to himself mostly. Some folks think he's standoffish, Others think he's just shy. He's had a hard time with women, Sarah added carefully. Not that he's unkind, but he doesn't seem to know what to say around them. Last year at the church social, Mrs. Patterson tried to introduce him to her niece, pretty girl visiting from St. Louis. Ethan turned bright red, mumbled something about checking his horse, and practically ran away. Clara found herself smiling despite her nerves. So I'm marrying a man who's terrified of social situations? Just the romantic ones, I think, Sarah said. Put him in a crisis, and he's steady as a rock. But ask him to make small talk at a dance, and he'd rather face down an angry bull. That's actually comforting, Clara admitted. At least we're equally terrified of this. Thursday evening, Pastor Wilson came to the boarding house to discuss the ceremony. He was a kind-faced man in his 50s who'd served Henderson's small church for nearly a decade. Miss Whitmore, he said gently, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Not because I doubt your decision, but because it's my responsibility to ensure you're entering into this marriage freely and with understanding. I appreciate that, Pastor. Are you marrying Mr. Cole because you have no other choice? Because you're desperate or afraid? Clara thought about how to answer honestly. I came to Texas desperate, yes, but I'm choosing Ethan Cole because I believe he's a good man who will honor his commitments. I'm choosing partnership over charity. That's not desperation, that's decision. Pastor Wilson nodded slowly. And you understand that marriage is a sacred covenant? That you'll be bound to him in the eyes of God and the law? I understand. Take that seriously. Then I'll perform the ceremony. But Clara, he leaned forward, his expression earnest, marriage is work, especially a marriage that begins like this, with two strangers choosing partnership over romance. There will be hard days, days when you question this decision, days when you wonder if you made a mistake. He paused. But if you both commit to seeing it through, to building something together, even when it's difficult, it can become something good, something lasting. That's all I'm hoping for, Clara said quietly. Something lasting that we build together. Friday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Clara woke early, her stomach a knot of nerves and anticipation. Today she would marry Ethan Cole. Today her life would change irrevocably. Helen brought breakfast to her room, but Clara could barely eat. She bathed carefully, using the last of the lavender soap she'd brought from Boston. She dressed in the altered gown, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who looked both terrified and determined. Her mother's small pearl earrings, the only jewelry she'd kept, glinted at her ears. Something old. The dress was newly altered. Sarah had provided a blue ribbon for her hair, and Helen had given her a handkerchief to borrow. You look beautiful, Helen said, her eyes moist with tears. Your mother would be proud of you, making a hard choice and making it with courage. I hope so, Clara whispered. I hope I'm doing the right thing. Only time will tell, but right now you look like a woman who knows her own mind. That's what matters. The wedding was set for 2:00 at the church. Clara walked there with Helen and Sarah, aware of eyes watching from windows and doorways. The whole town knew what was happening today. Let them watch. Let them see that she wasn't broken by Robert Mitchell's rejection. She was choosing her own future. Ethan was waiting on the church steps, and Clara's breath caught when she saw him. He'd cleaned up, new shirt, hair trimmed, boots polished. But it was his expression that stopped her heart. He looked at her like she was something precious, something worth all the work and risk and uncertainty. You look beautiful, he said quietly as she approached. So do you, Clara replied, then blushed. Handsome, I mean. You look handsome. His smile was small but genuine. Shall we? The church was simple, whitewashed walls and plain wooden pews. A handful of people had gathered, Sarah and her husband Helen, Mr. Harris from the general store, a few neighbors Clara didn't know, small witnesses to a quiet ceremony. Pastor Wilson took his place at the front, and Clara and Ethan stood before him. This was it, the moment that would define the rest of her life. Dearly beloved, Pastor Wilson began, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The words washed over Clara like water. She heard herself make responses, heard Ethan's voice steady and sure beside her. And then came the vows, the promises that would bind them. Do you, Ethan Cole, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do. Ethan's voice was clear, certain. And do you, Clara Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Clara looked at Ethan's face, at the gray eyes that had seen her at her lowest and offered her dignity, at the hands that had built a home and were now reaching for hers, at the man who'd given her choice, when everyone else had given her obligations. I do, she said, and meant it. The ring Ethan slipped onto her finger was simple silver, but it fit perfectly. He must have gone to the jeweler, must have guessed her size or asked someone's advice. The small thoughtfulness touched her deeply. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Pastor Wilson smiled. You may kiss your bride. Ethan's eyes asked permission, even though they were already married. Clara nodded slightly, and he leaned in, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that was brief and chaste, but somehow managed to convey promise. When he pulled back, his hand lingered at her waist. Mrs. Cole, he said softly, testing out her new name. Mr. Cole, she replied, and felt the strange weight of being someone's wife, of having legally bound her life to his. The small gathering clapped and offered congratulations. Sarah hugged her fiercely, despite the awkwardness of her pregnant belly. Helen pressed a basket of food into Ethan's hands. Mr. Harris gave Ethan a knowing look that made him flush slightly. And then they were outside in the afternoon sunlight, married, and everyone was waiting to see what they'd do next. I have the wagon, Ethan said. Brought it instead of the horses. Thought you might have things to bring from the boarding house. My trunk, and a few items Mrs. Brennan helped me gather. Clara felt suddenly, acutely aware that this was real. She would go home with this man, to his house, as his wife. They loaded her trunk into the wagon while the town watched. Clara changed from her wedding dress into traveling clothes, said goodbye to Helen with promises to visit, and let Ethan help her up onto the wagon seat. As they drove out of Henderson, Clara looked back once at the town that had witnessed both her humiliation and her wedding. It felt like a lifetime had passed since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, but it had been less than a week. 1 week to have her future destroyed and rebuilt into something entirely different. You all right? Ethan asked as the town disappeared behind them. Terrified, Clara admitted. But all right, I think. That makes 2 of us. He glanced at her and she saw the same nervousness she felt reflected in his expression. We'll figure this out as we go. No rush on anything. We'll take our time, let things develop naturally. Clara understood what he wasn't saying, the marriage bed, the intimacy that was expected. She appreciated his care in not pushing, even as her own nerves about that aspect of marriage made her stomach flutter. The ride to the ranch was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Clara watched the landscape roll by, golden grass and scattered trees and that endless sky. This would be her home now, this wild, beautiful, terrifying place. When they arrived at the ranch house, Ethan pulled the wagon up to the porch and set the brake. Welcome home, Clara Cole. The name still sounded foreign, but Clara tried it on like a new dress, seeing how it fit. Home, she repeated softly. Ethan carried her trunk inside and set it in the bedroom that was now hers, at least for tonight. He'd added things since she'd last been here, she noticed. A proper mirror on the wall, a vase with wildflowers on the dresser, a quilt on the bed that looked new. I'll sleep in the barn, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Until you're comfortable with other arrangements. No pressure. We move at your pace. Thank you, Clara whispered, touched by his consideration. They spent the evening in careful courtesy, preparing supper together, talking about small things, the ranch, the cattle, plans for the winter. Ethan showed her around properly, explaining his systems for managing the livestock, the garden space she could use, the creek where he drew water. As darkness fell, Clara found herself standing on the porch, looking out at land that was now partly hers. The stars were beginning to emerge, brilliant against the darkening sky. She heard Ethan moving inside, banking the fire, preparing to head to the barn. "Ethan?" she called. He appeared in the doorway. "Yes?" "Thank you. For today. For all of this. For giving me a choice when I had none." He stepped out onto the porch beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Thank you for choosing this, for taking a chance on a stranger's promise. I know that took courage." They stood together in companionable silence, two people bound by law and hope and mutual determination to make something good from impossible circumstances. "Good night, Clara," Ethan said finally. "Good night, Ethan." He walked to the barn, and Clara went inside to the bedroom that was now hers. She changed into her nightgown and lay down on the bed with the new quilt pulled up to her chin. Through the window, she could see the barn, could imagine Ethan settling into whatever rough arrangements he'd made for himself there. She was married, Mrs. Clara Cole, wife of a Texas rancher, partner in a venture that terrified and excited her in equal measure. Clara closed her eyes and found herself praying, not the formal prayers of her childhood, but something rawer and more honest. "Please let this work. Please let us build something good together. Please let me have made the right choice." And in the darkness of her new home, Clara Whitmore Cole fell asleep with hope cautiously blooming in her chest, ready to begin the hard work of turning a stranger into a partner and a marriage of convenience into something that might, possibly, become something more. Clara woke to sounds she didn't recognize, roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of the barn door opening. For a disorienting moment, she forgot where she was, reaching for familiar surroundings that no longer existed. Then memory flooded back. She was married. This was her home now, and somewhere outside, her husband was already beginning his day's work. She dressed quickly in her simplest dress and stepped out into the main room to find Ethan building up the fire, his movements efficient and practiced. He looked up when he heard her, and something uncertain crossed his face. "Morning," he said. "I was trying to be quiet, let you sleep." "I'm used to early mornings." Clara moved toward the kitchen area, assessing what needed to be done. "I'll make breakfast while you see to the animals." They fell into a rhythm over the following days that was both natural and awkward. Ethan would rise before dawn and handle the outdoor work while Clara managed the house, cooking meals that were simple, but better than anything he'd made for himself. They ate together, talking carefully about safe topics, the weather, the cattle, plans for winter preparations. They worked side by side on projects that required two sets of hands, and Clara learned quickly that ranch life demanded constant effort. Her hands blistered within the first week, hauling water from the creek, scrubbing clothes on a washboard, kneading bread dough, churning butter. All the tasks she'd done in Boston felt twice as hard here, where everything had to be done from scratch with primitive tools and sheer determination. Ethan noticed her raw palms one evening at supper and disappeared into the barn, returning with a tin of salve. "For the blisters," he said, setting it beside her plate. "It'll help them heal faster. Took me months to build up calluses when I first started ranching." Clara applied the salve that night, grateful for the relief and for his quiet thoughtfulness. He never made her feel weak for struggling, never criticized her attempts at tasks she'd never done before. Instead, he taught her patiently how to properly milk the cow he'd acquired, how to collect eggs without spooking the chickens, how to identify when the cattle were ailing. In turn, Clara brought order to aspects of the ranch Ethan had neglected. She reorganized the kitchen for efficiency, established a proper system for tracking expenses and income, and began planning a garden for spring that would reduce their dependence on expensive store-bought vegetables. She discovered she had a talent for the practical management of a household enterprise, and Ethan deferred to her judgment on domestic matters without the patronizing attitude she'd expected from a husband. "You're better at this than I ever was," he admitted one evening, reviewing the account ledger she'd created. "I could keep track of the numbers, but you've made sense of the whole operation. Can see at a glance where we're spending too much, where we could improve." "I managed my father's household accounts for years," Claire said. "This is larger in scale, but the principles are the same." "It's more than that." Ethan looked at her with something like admiration. "You see connections I miss, like how buying better feed now will mean healthier calves in spring, which means better prices at market. I was always focused on today's expenses, not long-term investment." The compliment warmed her more than she wanted to admit. She was proving herself valuable, showing that she brought more to this partnership than just another pair of hands. She was contributing to building something that mattered. But despite the growing comfort in their working relationship, the personal distance between them remained. Ethan still slept in the barn, still treated her with careful courtesy that never crossed into real intimacy. They were partners, roommates, business associates sharing a name and a home. But they weren't truly husband and wife, and Clara felt the incompleteness of it like a low-grade ache. 3 weeks into the marriage, Sarah Jenkins came to visit, her baby now cradled in her arms, a healthy boy named Thomas who'd arrived without complications. Clara welcomed her friend eagerly, desperate for female company and conversation that wasn't about cattle or supplies. "How are you managing?" Sarah asked as they sat on the porch while Thomas nursed. Really managing, not the polite answer. Clara considered lying, then decided Sarah deserved honesty. "The work is harder than I expected, but I'm managing, learning, getting stronger." She paused. "But Sarah, I feel like I'm living with a considerate stranger. We work well together, we talk about practical things, but there's this wall between us that neither of us seems to know how to cross." Sarah shifted the baby to her other arm. "Is he still sleeping in the barn?" "Yes, and I understand why. He's giving me time, being respectful. But it's been 3 weeks, and sometimes I wonder if he regrets marrying me, if he's keeping distance because he's realized he made a mistake." "Have you talked to him about it?" "How do you start that conversation?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "How do you tell your husband you're ready for him to actually be your husband without sounding desperate or improper?" Sarah laughed softly. "Clara, you're married. There's nothing improper about wanting your husband in your bed. And Ethan Cole strikes me as the kind of man who needs clear communication, not hints. He's probably terrified of pushing you, waiting for some signal he doesn't know how to recognize." "So I should just tell him?" "Yes. Be direct. Tell him what you want, what you're ready for." Sarah's expression turned serious. "But make sure it's what you actually want, not what you think you should want because you're married. There's no rush, despite what gossips might say." Clara thought about that conversation over the following days. What did she want? The honest answer was complicated. She wanted the distance to close, wanted to feel like Ethan's actual wife instead of his housekeeper. But she was also terrified of the vulnerability that intimacy would require, the trust it would demand. The decision was made for her by circumstance. A week later, a cold snap hit unexpectedly, dropping temperatures to near freezing. Clara woke shivering despite the blankets, and when she went outside, she found frost coating everything in delicate white patterns. Ethan came in from the barn with his breath visible in the air. "Gonna be a hard freeze tonight, maybe below 20 degrees. Will the cattle be all right?" "They've got shelter and they're hardy breeds, but I need to stay out there tonight, make sure the young ones don't get into trouble." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "The barn's going to be bitter cold. I might need to come inside, sleep by the fire, if that's all right with you." Clara made her decision. "You'll sleep in your own house, Ethan, in your own bed. It's absurd that you've been sleeping in the barn for weeks like some unwanted guest." "Clara, I don't want to make you uncomfortable. You're not." She met his eyes directly. "We're married. We've been married for a month. I think it's time we stopped pretending this is a temporary arrangement and started living like an actual married couple." Ethan went very still. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Clara felt her courage wavering but forced herself to continue. "I'm not saying everything has to change tonight, but you're sleeping inside in a proper bed. We'll figure out the rest as we go." That night, after a simple supper eaten mostly in charged silence, they prepared for bed with awkward formality. Clara changed in the bedroom while Ethan banked the fire. When she emerged in her nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, she found him standing by the bedroom door looking uncertain. "I can sleep out here by the fire if you'd prefer," he offered. "No." Clara's voice was quieter than she intended. "Come to bed, Ethan. It's your house, your room. I won't have you sleeping on the floor." They lay down on opposite sides of the bed, a careful distance between them, both staring at the ceiling in the darkness. The intimacy of sharing a bed, even this chaste version, felt enormous after weeks of separation. Clara could hear Ethan's breathing, could feel the warmth of his body across the narrow space that separated them. "Clara?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes?" Thank you for being patient with me, for not expecting more than I know how to give. She turned toward him in the darkness, though she could barely make out his features. The same to you. I know I'm not what you might have hoped for in a wife. I'm learning as I go. You're exactly what I hoped for. The certainty in his voice surprised her. You work hard, you're honest, you make this house feel like a home. That's everything I wanted. Is it enough? Clara asked softly. Partnership and respect and shared work? Can that be enough for a marriage? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I think it's a good foundation. Better than passion that burns out or romance that fades when reality sets in. We're building something solid, Clara, something that'll last. But what about affection? About actually caring for each other beyond just working well together? She felt him shift in the darkness, moving slightly closer. I do care about you, more than I expected to this quickly. I care when you're tired, when your hands hurt from work, when you get that look on your face like you're worried about something. I care about your happiness, your comfort, your safety. He paused. Maybe that's not romantic love like in books, but it's real. And it's growing. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. I care about you too. I worry when you're out in bad weather. I notice when you're pushing yourself too hard. I find myself watching for you to come in for supper, and I'm disappointed when you're late. She gave a shaky laugh. Is this what falling in love feels like? Because it's not at all what the novel suggested. Maybe it's what real love feels like, Ethan said quietly. The kind that builds slowly, based on respect and partnership and actually knowing each other. Not the dramatic kind that hits like lightning. He reached across the space between them, and Clara felt his rough, calloused hand find hers in the darkness. She laced her fingers through his, feeling the strength and warmth of his grip. Can I hold you? He asked, his voice uncertain. Just hold you. Nothing more. Not unless you want it. I'd like to stop sleeping at arm's length from my own wife. In answer, Clara moved closer, and Ethan's arms came around her carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. She rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. It felt right in a way that surprised her, natural and comforting, and like coming home to something she hadn't known she was missing. Is this all right? He murmured against her hair. It's perfect, Clara whispered back. They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's warmth, and when Clara woke in the night, she found herself still held securely in Ethan's arms. She smiled in the darkness and let herself drift back to sleep, feeling safer and more content than she had in years. The physical closeness broke something open between them. Over the following weeks, they grew gradually more comfortable with affection. A hand on the shoulder in passing, sitting close together in the evenings, goodnight kisses that lengthened from brief pecks to something warmer. Clara found herself looking forward to bedtime, to the quiet conversations they had in the darkness, to the feel of Ethan's arms around her. Winter deepened, and ranch work shifted to maintenance and survival. They spent long evenings by the fire, Clara reading aloud from the few books she'd brought while Ethan mended tack or worked on repairs. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Slowly, the strangers became friends, and the friends became something more. It was during a fierce snowstorm in January that their marriage became complete. They'd been trapped inside for 2 days, the world beyond the windows a white howl of wind and ice. Cabin fever had them both restless, and they'd been playing cards to pass the time. I'm terrible at this game, Clara said, throwing down her losing hand with a laugh. You've won every round. You keep trying to bluff when your face gives away everything you're thinking. Ethan's smile was warm, affectionate. You get this little crease between your eyebrows when you have a bad hand. I do not. You absolutely do. Right there. He reached across the table and gently touched the spot between her brows, and the casual intimacy of the gesture made Clara's breath catch. Their eyes met and held, and something shifted in the air between them. The playfulness faded into something deeper, more intense. Ethan's hand moved from her forehead to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with devastating gentleness. Clara, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I need you to tell me if you want me to stop. Because if you don't say something right now, I'm going to kiss you properly, and I'm not sure I'll be able to keep things chaste after that. In answer, Clara leaned forward and kissed him first, pouring months of growing affection and need into the contact. Ethan made a sound low in his throat and stood, pulling her up with him, his arms coming around her as the kiss deepened into something that made her head spin. "Bedroom," he murmured against her lips. "Unless you want to scandalize the furniture." Clara laughed breathlessly and let him lead her to the bedroom they'd been sharing platonically for weeks. But there was nothing platonic about the way he looked at her as they crossed the threshold, nothing restrained about the way his hands trembled slightly as he helped her out of her dress. What followed was tender and awkward and perfect in its imperfection. Ethan was careful with her, constantly checking that she was all right, that he wasn't hurting her. And Clara found that the intimacy wasn't frightening at all when it was with someone she trusted, someone she'd grown to care for deeply over months of shared work and conversation. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, the storm still raging outside, but the room warm and safe. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. "More than all right." Clara turned to face him, seeing her own wonder reflected in his expression. "That was not at all what I expected." "Better or worse?" "Better. So much better." She paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "Though I suspect we'll improve with practice." Ethan's laugh was surprised and delighted. "I married a practical woman." "You married a woman who loves you," Clara said, the words emerging before she'd consciously decided to speak them. "I didn't plan to. I certainly didn't expect to. But somewhere between partnership and friendship and lying next to you every night, I fell in love with you, Ethan Cole." His arms tightened around her, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "Good. Because I love you too. Have for weeks, probably. Just didn't know if I was allowed to say it when the marriage started the way ours did." "You're allowed to say anything you feel," Clara said. "We're past pretending this is just a practical arrangement." "Thank God for that," Ethan murmured. "Being in love with my own wife and having to pretend I wasn't was getting exhausting." They made love again as the storm raged, this time with less awkwardness and more confidence, learning each other's responses, discovering what brought pleasure. And when they finally fell asleep, Clara knew with bone-deep certainty that she'd made the right choice all those months ago. She'd chosen this man, this life, this future, and it had become something more beautiful than she'd dared to hope. Spring came with an explosion of wildflowers that turned the prairie into a carpet of color. Clara's garden flourished under her care, providing vegetables that reduced their expenses and improved their diet. The cattle had come through winter healthy, and several cows were heavy with calves that would expand their herd. But the most significant change was in Clara herself. When she looked in the mirror now, she saw a different woman than the desperate mail-order bride who'd arrived in Henderson 7 months ago. Her hands were calloused, her skin sun-darkened, her body stronger from months of physical labor. But more importantly, her eyes were different. They held confidence, contentment, the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd built a life with her own hands. She was in the garden one afternoon in early May when she saw a wagon approaching. Visitors were rare, and Clara stood brushing dirt from her dress and shading her eyes against the sun. As the wagon drew closer, her stomach dropped. It was Evelyn Mitchell. Ethan emerged from the barn, saw the wagon, and moved to stand beside Clara with a hand on her shoulder. "Want me to send her away?" "No," Clara said, lifting her chin. "Let's see what she wants." Evelyn climbed down from her wagon, looking less polished than before, her dress expensive but showing signs of wear. She approached with something that might have been embarrassment on her face. "Mrs. Cole," she said stiffly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "What can we do for you, Mrs. Mitchell?" Clara kept her voice neutral. Evelyn glanced at Ethan, then back to Clara. "I came to apologize. And to ask for help, though I have no right to ask anything of you." Clara exchanged a look with Ethan. "Perhaps you'd better explain." "May we speak privately? Woman to woman?" Ethan squeezed Clara's shoulder gently. "I'll be in the barn if you need me." He walked away, leaving the two women alone on the porch. Clara gestured to the chairs. "Sit. Talk." Evelyn sat heavily, and Clara noticed the strain around her eyes, the way her hands twisted in her lap. "Robert is not the man I remembered, the man I married." She laughed bitterly. Or perhaps he's exactly that man, and I was too desperate to see it clearly. What's happened? He's spent through most of my money already. Bad investments, gambling, expensive tastes he can't afford. We're mortgaged to the hilt, and he's talking about selling my property, the land I inherited from my first husband, to cover his debts. Evelyn's voice shook. I've made a terrible mistake, but I'm trapped in it. Clara felt a surprising surge of sympathy. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the only woman in Henderson who might understand what it's like to be desperate enough to make foolish choices. Evelyn met Clara's eyes. And because I was cruel to you when you were vulnerable, and I'm sorry. I was so determined to believe I'd won something worth having that I convinced myself you were the pathetic one. But you made the better choice. You chose a man of honor over a man of means, and you've built something real. While I chose poorly, and I'm paying for it. Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying the woman who'd once offered her work as a maid. What kind of help are you asking for? Advice. You manage Ethan's accounts. Everyone knows that. You've turned this ranch into a profitable operation. I need to understand how to protect what's left of my assets before Robert destroys everything. Evelyn's pride visibly crumbled. I can pay you for your time. Not much, but something. Clara thought about the woman she'd been when she arrived in Henderson. Desperate, alone, willing to take any help offered. She thought about Ethan's words about helping when help was needed. And she thought about the kind of woman she wanted to be now that she had the power to choose. I'll help you, Clara said quietly. Not for payment, but because no woman should be left helpless by a husband's poor decisions. But Evelyn, you need to understand. I can show you how to manage accounts, how to protect assets legally, but I can't fix your marriage. That's between you and Robert. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. I don't deserve your kindness. Probably not, Clara agreed with surprising gentleness. But I'm giving it anyway. Come back Thursday afternoon. We'll go over your financial situation and see what can be salvaged. After Evelyn left, Ethan emerged from the barn. That was unexpected. Life is full of surprises, Clara said, watching the wagon disappear down the road. She made my arrival here miserable, but I can't leave her drowning when I have the knowledge to help. Ethan pulled her into his arms. This is why I love you. You could have sent her away. Instead, you're offering help to someone who is cruel to you. My mother used to say that how we treat people when we have power over them reveals who we really are. Clara leaned into his embrace. I want to be someone who helps, not someone who takes revenge. Over the following weeks, Clara worked with Evelyn to untangle her finances and establish protections that would preserve what remained of her property. It was delicate work, requiring discretion and legal maneuvering, but Clara had learned enough about frontier law to navigate the complexities. She also made Evelyn promise to speak with Pastor Wilson about the state of her marriage, to at least try to salvage what could be saved. Whether Robert and Evelyn Mitchell would find their way to happiness, Clara didn't know. But she'd done what she could, and that felt like enough. Summer brought its own challenges and joys. The garden produced abundantly, requiring long days of harvesting and preserving. The calves were born healthy, increasing their herd value substantially. And Clara discovered she was pregnant, the news bringing both terror and joy in equal measure. A baby, Ethan said wonderingly, his hand splayed across her still flat stomach. We're going to have a baby. Are you ready for this? Clara asked, her own fear evident. Neither of us planned this so soon. I don't know that anyone's ever ready. Ethan kissed her gently. But we'll figure it out together, like we've figured out everything else. Sarah Jenkins became an invaluable resource, teaching Clara what to expect, what to prepare, how to manage pregnancy while still running a household. Helen sent supplies and advice from town, and Ethan treated Clara like she was made of glass, until she finally snapped at him that pregnancy wasn't an illness and she was perfectly capable of doing her normal work. I'm just worried, he admitted. You're 3 hours from a doctor. What if something goes wrong? Then we handle it, Clara said firmly. Women have been having babies in difficult circumstances since the beginning of time. I'm strong, healthy, and I have you. That's more than many women have. The baby arrived on a cold February morning almost exactly 1 year after Clara had stepped off that stagecoach in Henderson. The labor was long and difficult, with only Ethan and Sarah there to help. There were moments when Clara was certain she couldn't do it, when the pain seemed impossible to endure. But Ethan held her hand through every contraction, wiped her face with cool cloths, and told her over and over that she was the strongest person he'd ever known. When their daughter finally entered the world with a lusty cry, Clara wept with relief and exhaustion and overwhelming love. Ethan cut the cord with shaking hands, and when Sarah placed the baby in Clara's arms, his face held such wonder that Clara fell in love with him all over again. "She's perfect," Ethan whispered, touching one tiny hand with his rough finger. "You're perfect. How do we have something so perfect?" They named her Rose, after the wildflowers that had bloomed on the ranch when they first admitted they loved each other. And as Clara held her daughter and watched her husband gaze at them both with naked adoration, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd come to Texas as a mail-order bride, replaced before she'd even arrived, standing humiliated in a dusty street with no future and no hope. She'd been offered charity and contempt in equal measure, told she was worthless by the man who'd promised her a future. But then a cowboy with gray eyes and calloused hands had stepped forward and said she was free to choose him. And in choosing him, in choosing partnership over security, honesty over comfort, building something together over accepting handouts, she'd found a life richer than anything she'd imagined. The ranch prospered over the following years. They expanded their herd, purchased additional grazing land, built a new barn. Clara's garden became legendary in the county, providing not just for their family, but enough surplus to sell at market. She took on several other women as clients, helping them manage household accounts and protect their interests, building a small consulting business that brought in additional income. Rose grew into a bright, curious child who loved helping her father with the cattle and learning to read with her mother. 2 years later, she was joined by a brother, James, who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Clara to the hilltop where he'd first shown her the ranch. They stood looking down at the valley, at the house that had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, at the thriving operation they'd built together. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked quietly. "Marrying a stranger? Giving up the possibility of going back to Boston? Of finding something easier?" Clara thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, desperate, alone, willing to accept any offer that promised security. She thought about all the hard work, the blistered hands, the long, lonely days, the fears and challenges. And she thought about everything she'd gained, a partner who respected her, children she adored, a home she'd built with her own effort, a life that was completely and absolutely her own. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "Being replaced was the best thing that ever happened to me. It freed me to choose something real instead of settling for what was offered. It brought me to you." Ethan pulled her close, and they stood together watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Below them, their home glowed with lamplight, their children's laughter carrying faintly on the evening breeze. "Thank you," Ethan said, "for choosing me, for taking a chance on a cowboy who didn't know how to do anything but offer honesty and hard work. Thank you for seeing me when everyone else saw only a problem to be solved or a scandal to gossip about," Clara replied. "You gave me back my dignity. More than that, you gave me a future worth fighting for." They walked back down to the house, hand in hand, to the life they'd built from nothing but determination and mutual respect and a growing love that had started as partnership and become something unshakable. Clara had traveled halfway across the country to marry a stranger who didn't want her, only to find the man who did, the man who saw her worth, who valued her partnership, who loved her not despite her desperation, but because of the strength it revealed. She'd been told she was replaced, disposable, not good enough. But a cowboy had said she was free to choose him instead. And in that choice, in that moment of claiming her own destiny, Clara Whitmore Cole had found not just a husband but a home, not just security but purpose, not just survival but a life fully and completely claimed. The mail-order bride who'd been rejected had become the heart of a thriving ranch, the center of a loving family, the author of her own remarkable story. And every time Clara looked at her children, at her husband, at the land they'd built together through hard work and honest effort, she knew that being replaced had been the greatest gift she'd ever received, because it had freed her to choose something real, something lasting, something entirely, beautifully, perfectly hers.